In this video, I want to look at adding documentation when you use Python inside Power Query. I've loaded in this dataset from the pandas GitHub page called iris CSV, which is something about flowers. I simply needed a dataset. Since I'll be manipulating a table, I can go under transform and use a run Python script, which is going to give us this dataset variable. I want to start out by importing pandas and importing numpy because I want to do some statistics. I want to start out by creating a variable called summary, which is then equal to pd.dataframe, where I want to manipulate the dataset, which is then going to equal my source step, which is a dataset, and I want to describe this. And we can start out actually just by seeing what this does. And then it's going to get mad. Apparently I need to add a capital F, and this is fine, there's nothing dangerous. We can see I get the dataset, which is then equal to my source step, which is then this step, and that's not exciting, but we can see my summary variable because this function outputs a dataset. I can see that under the value, and I might want to expand that so we can see it. Actually, it doesn't even give me the first column, so you'll have to infer what this means, or you could look up the documentation. So you'd need to look up the documentation, which we can then see here. I've just gone onto the page. You can see count. In other words, how many rows do I have? Mean, standard deviation, and so on. And then the distribution. That's fine. I can then add more to my script where I want to create a function inside Python, which I then call inside of my run Python script function in Power Query. So it's a lot of chains. I want to make this function that grabs the median, which when we define functions in Python, you write def in front. And I'm going to say this wants a variable called x and then a colon because Python loves colons. And you probably don't need this function, but I want to show it. And Python also cares about indentation, so I need to have 4 spaces. Or I can click the tab key. I want my function to return the value x.quartile 0.5. And we can see that because this function doesn't output anything, it doesn't output a table, nothing actually happens. But I now have this function inside of my code, which I can then use if I want to. And now I want to make a more complicated script. I want to show which variable output anything that we can then expand in Power Query and which do not. And I also want to show how to add documentation. That's kind of the point of this video. I'm going to run the Python script, and it's actually a bad idea to do it here because my output is then going to set the dataset variable to equal to the current step here, but we can change that after. Because once again, it's going to assume that I want to run the Python script on the previous step, which is going to be correct most of the time. Like always, I want to start out by importing pandas, and unfortunately, when you get your variables back as the output of this function, these don't get sorted chronologically by which line they're on. They get sorted based on based on the name. That's why I want to add a prefix, say a dataset, which I simply set to equal to the dataset. And this is actually unnecessary, but I want to show it anyway. Then I want to add a filter where I say I want to go into the dataset table. The way you filter in pandas is what's called the df syntax, which is to say I want to set my variable to equal table, the table dataset, and then I have the square brackets, which means it's a list or a column. And the column I want is then go into the dataset table, the column called name.
5 minutes later.
But that also doesn't work. However, I can convert that dictionary into a table object, or actually a data frame, and that works. And the output of this script is then going to be a bunch of variables. And that was my problem here because, like I mentioned before I started writing, it's going to assume that I want to apply my Python script to the previous step, but I don't want to apply that to source. And then we can see I get the dataset OG, which is simply the dataset. That's what I expect. And B is then a filter table that also works. C does not work, where I simply print a value. And we can see dataset, and this is what I said, it sorts alphabetically, which also means that I actually get dataset between B and E, even though dataset is my first value. I think it gets mad if you change what the dataset is called. Actually, I just need to add that here. Actually, I need to add that every place where I change dataset. Yeah, it's probably easier to change in here. Okay, so you can do it, change what dataset is called, but that's a bad idea. You should just accept that this is a peculiar function and just write dataset instead. But I wanted to show it. Like I mentioned, this gdocu doesn't get printed inside of my variables here. This isn't a data frame, but if I then use the pd.dataframe function, I can convert that dictionary into a data frame. And then we get this. And then if you really wanted to, you could do something like triple quotes in order to do multi-lines. adding CR here, in other words caret return, because I know in Power Query when we add line breaks it likes to add both, but it looks like it doesn't. So I don't know if we can add line breaks. You would add multiple rows to the dictionary, which would be here, I guess. Yeah, so that's fine, except you'd probably want to transpose this. But in any case, yep,